Good morning and welcome. I'm Vishakha Desai, Special Advisor on Global Affairs to President Bollinger and a faculty member on the Committee on Global Thought. On behalf of my colleagues in the committee, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2015 Global Thought Lecture, which is also a World's Leader Forum program. Both the Committee on Global Thought, or CGT as we like to call it, and the World Leaders Forum are initiatives of President Bollinger, designed to enhance, expand, and strengthen the global dimensions of this great university. Just a word about CGT. It's an interdisciplinary community of more than 25 senior scholars from all parts of the Columbia campus dedicated to developing new analytic concepts and methodologies relevant to forms and processes of globalization. We like to go beyond our specific disciplines and specific focus on particular geographies. Ultimately, our aim is to create new forms of knowledge essential to meet the challenges inherent in the interconnected world of the 21st century. Our work involves three different aspects of the university life: multidisciplinary research projects, pedagogical programs, notably the new MA in Global Thought, which we launched this fall, and public programs such as this one. Let me also just mention the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought. Some of you are here from that committee. They organize special programs on global themes, including preparatory workshops for select world leader fora, such as the one today. And we had a fantastic program last night just to prep everybody for Mr. Rudd's remarks. Given the mandate of the Committee on Global Thought, you will see why we are especially honored to host the Honorable Kevin Rudd at Columbia. A true global thinker, a distinguished public servant, and a formidable intellectual. I know those three things don't always go together, so it's rather rare to have it in one person. We know this from politicians in our own country. I've had the honor of working with and seeing Mr. Rudd in action over the past decade, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed. His topic, Rise of China and its impact on the global order, reminds us that the very idea of interdependent world must take into account the profoundly changing power equations all around us. Following Mr. Rudd's lecture, Stephen Cohen, Executive Director of the Earth Institute and a professor in the practice of public affairs at SIPA, will provide a brief response, and then we'll open up the floor to all of you for an active discussion with our distinguished speaker. Please feel free to tweet away what you hear and share with your friends. The hashtag for the program is WLFRUD, and that's WLF and R capital. Let me just take a moment to thank a few people who have worked very hard to organize today's program. That includes the staff of CGT, as well as the staff in the President's office here at Columbia, and the staff in Mr. Rudd's office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Now, it's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to President Lee Bollinger, a visionary leader and the one who is truly committed to making Columbia a significant global university in content, strategy, and practice. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Lee Bollinger.
Good morning, and I want to thank Vishakha and the members of the Committee on Global Thought for making events like this one happen. As Vishakha has said, there are few people in public life better equipped to discuss China's rise and the impact of that national ascendance on the world today than our guest, the Honorable Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd serves as president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, a very significant post in its own right, yet one that only hints at the breadth and depth of his experience with China. Indeed, his special insights about the world's largest nation have been long in the making. By age 15, Mr. Rudd possessed a keen interest in diplomacy and world events and decided to reach out to someone able to inform him about how best to pursue his ambition. Sensibly, he wrote to the Prime Minister at the time, all of you, I'm sure, write to the President of the United States to express your interest in a future diplomat, and he received a reply urging him to attend university, not Columbia, and study one of the languages of Asia. The immersion in Chinese history and language served him well, leading to diplomatic posts first in Beijing and then in Stockholm. He later served in Parliament representing the Labour Party. Elected as Australia's 26th Prime Minister in 2007, he quickly established himself as an exemplary head of state. I remember hearing a number of people talk about this extraordinary new person on the world political scene. With the adoption of a widely praised economic stimulus package, he helped Australia successfully navigate the global financial crisis. He also advocated for the expansion of the East Asia Summit and was instrumental in the creation of the G20 Forum, a venue essential to the coordination of international economic policy during the crisis and beyond. On his very first day in office, Mr. Rudd signed the Kyoto Protocol, and he embarked on high-profile efforts to combat climate change. He also delivered an historic apology to Indigenous Australians on behalf of the government and the Australian people. Before inviting our guest to the stage, I only want to say this about our subject this morning. There is no more relevant prism through which to consider the complexities of our modern world than a discussion of China's growth and evolution. Every single issue of importance is alive there. National economic policy, the organization and oversight of capital markets and finance, balancing development against the urgent need to address climate change, the pressing need to alleviate widespread poverty, questions about whether stunning advances in communications technology will be employed to enlighten citizens or to censor them, and ultimately profound questions about whether a culture that largely rejects the free expression and the freedom of the press embraced by this nation can succeed over time in a global economy that prizes innovation and intellectual creativity. Not surprisingly, here at Columbia, we are preoccupied with all of these and many other similar questions, and we are studying them in a host of different ways. For all these reasons, this is an exceedingly timely opportunity to be hearing from our guest. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Kevin Rudd.
Thank you, President Bollinger, for those kind words of welcome. Thank you also, Vishakha, who I've known for more years than either of us care to remember, and for her great leadership of the Asia Society over many years. And also to Steve Cohen, who is Executive Director of the Earth Institute. And to you, all the young women and men of the world, not just America, but the world. Thank you for your welcome here to this truly great American university, this truly great global university that is Columbia. Who was it who said this? I regard Columbia as the great university of the future. It is not only the most cosmopolitan educational center in this country, Harvard, eat your heart out, but has a warm place in the hearts of the intelligent Chinese at home. These words were spoken by one Columbia graduate after the completion of his doctorate 100 years ago this year. This talented student from Shanghai, whose name was Gu Weijun, wrote a dissertation full of nuance, humanity, empathy, rare commodities in China's relations with the West at that time. He went on to write the following: mutual forbearance and reciprocal concession are no less the best policy in the intercourse between nations than in the relations between individuals. Gu also pointed optimistically to the growing convergence of Chinese and Western interests in the world, rejecting the common delusions, to use his words, that they were inherently antagonistic. 100 years later, we today could all use a dose of Gu Weijun's optimism, his measured optimism. His great and later success in life was accompanied by an even greater humility. In 1912, when Gu had only finished 3 chapters of his dissertation, the Chinese minister summoned him to Washington. The minister offered him a job on the recommendation of the premier of the fledgling Chinese Republic. Gu declined the offer immediately, citing his desire to finish his studies at Columbia and get his dissertation done. Note that carefully, all of you. However, the Chinese premier at the time, less than 1 year after the fall of the last Chinese empire, the Qing, in 1911, the Chinese premier and his own supervisor pressured the young Gu, who finally accepted the offer. His training right here at Columbia provided him with a cosmopolitan environment in which to hone his natural talents. He perfected his French, he perfected his German, his English, becoming an accomplished orator and debater here at Columbia, a mover and shaker in student politics, a proud editor of the Columbia Daily Spectator, which I gather is still in publication today. Gu Weijun is known in the English-speaking world as Dr. Wellington Koo, and his illustrious diplomatic career is now the stuff of legend. He negotiated an end to the unequal treaties which had subjugated China to the Western powers for a century. He represented China at the 1919 Versailles Treaty, refusing to sign an agreement which not only disregarded Chinese interests, but instead sacrificed those interests to Japan. He later served as the acting Prime Minister of China, Ambassador to France, Great Britain, the United States, and was a signatory to the United Nations Charter at San Francisco in 1945. Wellington Koo's remarkable career mirrors China's tumultuous history during the course of the 20th century. His life's philosophy, summed up in one paragraph, can be gleaned from a passage in his dissertation, where he writes the following: "If, to the intelligent and intensely patriotic efforts of the Chinese people to regenerate their country, there are added the sympathy and moral support of the treaty powers, the rise of a powerful and progressive China will surely be hastened 100-fold. And China in progress and power means the Far East in permanent peace," unquote. Wellington Koo believed that the rise of a powerful and progressive China would not put it at odds with the established great powers, despite the fact that these same great powers had divided and weakened China for nearly 100 years by that time. With their support, Wellington Koo argued, China's rise would become the keystone of lasting peace in Asia. This is of profound importance. In today's foreign policy environment, Wellington Koo would perhaps be written off as a misty-eyed idealist for defying the proposition that China's rise will automatically lead to a conflict with the existing great powers, if not war. Wellington Koo worked assiduously for 40 years to re-establish China's place in the world, and within the confines of the political context within which he worked, charted his own course for the national rejuvenation of China, Fuxing, a rejuvenation he predicted almost a century ahead of its time. Of course, the historical record is that coups sided with the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek against the Communist Party in the Civil War, although both sides fought the Japanese invasion under the terms of the United Front. The value of the Academy, in particular this great Academy here at Columbia, is one which also nurtures the long-term study of China, as you have done within these walls as well. And my observation today is in the midst of all the Sturm und Drang, the thunder and lightning of day-to-day international relations, the value and the virtue of the Academy is that we are able to pause and reflect on the lessons of history, both good and bad. And that includes the reflections of Dr. Gu Weijun in these grounds 100 years ago, and his conclusion that China's rise could be achieved peacefully despite all of its inherent complexity, rather than China becoming yet another doleful illustration of what international relations theorists describe as Thucydides' trap, whereby a rising great power challenging an established great power will almost inevitably result in conflict and war. I regard disproving Thucydides' trap as it relates to the rise of China and its relationship with the United States of America as the preeminent foreign policy challenge of our time. The beginning of wisdom in international relations is to understand how the other sees reality and why it is that they see reality in those terms. This is a core part of the project in which your university, through the Global Thought Centre, is engaged. This is particularly important when we are dealing with the rapid re-emergence, or as China would see it, its further re-emergence as a global great power. China's worldview is deeply shaped by its history as one of the oldest civilizations, with a continuing written language, literary and philosophical tradition stretching over 3,000 years, and the glories of its own imperial past. For China, the mark of history is profound, as are the scars of collective memory. History has shaped China's strategic perceptions of the United Kingdom, the United States, the rest of the colonizing West, as well as, of course, Japan as a colonial power as well. In China's account of its historical engagement with the world, one can identify several themes that continue to shape its own interactions with other nations and international institutions. First, China, at least over the last 500 years, has not sought to invade either the West, Japan, or any other country so as to provoke the imperial carve-up of its own territory, which unfolded through the 19th century and beyond. Second, in China's view, it has been the victim of international aggression rather than a perpetrator, particularly during its perceived century of national humiliation. Third, Chinese losses during the Japanese occupation were of staggering proportions by global standards, not dissimilar to those suffered by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, explaining in part Beijing's continued neuralgia towards Tokyo, both in terms of the official Japanese account of the war, as well as its professed deep reservations about Japanese remilitarization. Fourth, China's preoccupations have historically been largely domestic, namely governing a quarter of humanity rather than dreaming of carving out an overseas empire for itself, even when it was capable of doing so during the Ming, as Japanese and European empires themselves sought to do. Fifth, China regained its proper place in the community of nations as a result of its own national efforts, rather than depending on the benevolence of others, and is now in a position to shape its own future, rather than having its future determined by others. And finally, modern Chinese leaders have a profound sense that China's time has now come, although they are deeply concerned that other great powers may seek to prevent it from assuming what it believes to be its proper place in the community of nations, because its rise could challenge continuing US regional and global dominance. While Chinese leaders remain acutely conscious of the array of domestic and international challenges still to be addressed, they are also aware that China, for the first time in its history, now occupies a respected and powerful place in the world. The days of China being seen as the sick man of Asia, 东亚病夫, universally the case in Wellington Coos' time, are now long gone. China has returned to a level of national wealth and power which was unimaginable in the times that Wellington Koo studied here in around 1915. Of course, according to President Xi Jinping, there is much to be done in what he describes as the great and continuing task of national rejuvenation. That task will not be a smooth one, as the current debate on the future of the Chinese economy demonstrates. However, the question which presents itself to us, if China continues to rise, which I on balance believe it will, is what type of international order will China now seek? Will it be radically different from the one that we have in the world today? Or will it be a more creative variation of a continuing theme? It is on this question that I would like to reflect today. With history as a guide, we might observe the preservation of international order is no easy thing, while the construction of a genuinely global order is virtually without precedent. In these sobering years of anniversaries, 2015, the anniversary of the Congress of Vienna, the bicentenary, I should say, of the Congress of Vienna, 1914, the centenary of the war to end all wars, now in 2014, and with 1945, today the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, the world war that followed the war to end all wars. We are all haunted afresh by the ghosts of institutional failure. Out of the embers and the ruins of 45 was born what we now describe as the post-war rules-based international order. From the outset, it was a fusion of liberal aspiration and realist power, crowned by the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, and underpinned by the reality of virtually unchallenged American military and economic might. And America did not do such a bad job of it, given where we had come from. Building a durable international order remains the central challenge of international relations today. Again, if history is our guide, it tells us that orders of one form or another are difficult to build, but not difficult to destroy. We need only reflect on the sorry history of the League of Nations as our most recent case in point. If we ignore the centrality of the international order, fail to recognise the seeds of any impending disintegration, or else believe that orders are somehow inherently self-sustaining, then we fail to learn the core lesson of history, and in doing so, we abdicate our responsibility for the future. We can begin by asking ourselves what has fundamentally changed in world politics since 45. First, decolonisation over the last 70 years, which has seen the quadrupling of the number of member states of the United Nations. 50 of us back in 1945, 195 or thereabouts today. Second, the end of the Cold War, although after 20 years of relative calm, the future trajectory of US-Russia relations is once again uncertain. Third, economic globalisation, together with the incapacity of weak global and national institutions to deal effectively with global economic challenges, in turn inducing a crisis of confidence in existing multilateral economic and financial institutions. Fourth, the emerging range of other global challenges, most recently and spectacularly in Europe, the refugees crisis. for which the existing UN-based institutions are increasingly seen to be inadequate to the task, giving rise to a much broader debate on the deficit of global governance we have today. And fifth, and finally, these great drivers of change in the post-45 order, the rise of China, means that the United States will no longer necessarily be the world's largest global economy. And this in turn giving rise to questions about the future of American global future strategic resolve, which rests on its as yet unmatched military power. Against this background, what can usefully be said about China's aspirations for the future of the global order? Again, let me try and explain the view, at least as seen from Beijing. China recognises that it has benefited from the current order so far, particularly in facilitating the export-based growth that has driven China's economic rise over 30 years. China resents, however, and rejects the US notion that China needs to become what the Americans described as a responsible global stakeholder. For China sees this notion as condescending in its assumption that China is not a responsible global stakeholder already, relative at least to the role played by other states in the international community today. Number three, China nonetheless has no interest in any fundamental repudiation of the existing global order, not least because it is highly wary of the possibility of its own national overreach relative to what it's observed with other great powers, and does not at this stage see itself in any way as an indispensable global power when it comes to the provision of global public goods. Number four, Chinese think tanks are nonetheless hard at work envisaging China's future role in a new international order. However, it would be wrong to conclude that China at this stage has any agreed blueprint for the systematic reform of the order, let alone an entirely different order. Five, China, however, is now likely to become an increasingly active voice in the normal review processes of the international system, in pursuit of its general principle of advocating greater multipolarity in international relations, a term which is a none too subtle code for reducing unilateral American power. Six, China's position in this is strengthened by the growing international support it has secured across the G77, reinforced by China's expanding economic assistance program and growing foreign direct investment presence across the developing world. Seven, China has long seen the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, as an asset to its own international influence, as well as a useful vehicle for developing an increasingly multipolar order. China, therefore, has no interest in the UN becoming less relevant over time, and in fact would prefer it to become more relevant over time. Eight, for similar reasons, China has welcomed its role in the G20 and is more likely to seek to expand the G20's global influence over time, including under its own presidency of the G20 next year in 2016. By contrast, it sees the G7 as a comfortable Western club with comfortable armchairs, full of folks from the former colonial world, and quietly dying in their chairs. 9. As for the Bretton Woods institutions, China is smarting following the refusal of the United States Senate to increase China's quota at the IMF, even though a quota increase for China has the support of both the G20 and IMF member states. And 10, in part for these reasons, China has chosen to establish the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank outside the Bretton Woods framework, and it is possible that China will further innovate in the international financial and economic domain where its global strength is greatest. Given these factors, what then is to be done if a functioning global order is to be preserved for the future? Ultimately, this is a question for nation states, but a few thoughts for the United States and China to consider jointly. If China and the United States were to work conjointly on the future reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, I believe that would be good for the international community. For example, it would be good to see representatives from East Asia, not simply the United States and Western Europe, head the principal institutions of the Bretton Woods machinery, namely the IMF and the World Bank. The tradition of simply placing a European in charge of one such institution and an American in charge of the other may have been relevant in previous decades. I'm not so sure it's relevant for the future. Another important reform by the IMF from China's perspective is the inclusion of the renminbi in the special drawing rights basket. It's important that this not become the sort of internationally divisive debate that we saw recently with the emergence of the AIIB. Further, reforming the IMF's voting provisions would give Asia a more decisive role in the organisation. We know where that history has been most recently. For the United Nations itself, the Security Council reform, if it is ever to be executed, would need to see more voices from Asia, from countries like India, Indonesia, and possibly Japan. Furthermore, it may be possible to see a greater role for China within the individual institutions of the UN itself. It's important that we note that China has already, for the first time, begun to increase its formal participation in multilateral aid programs through the institutions of the UN rather than exclusively rely on bilateral programs. China has also begun to become a significant contributor to UN peacekeeping operations in the world, and of the P5 member states of the UN Security Council is now the largest contributor. These various reform proposals are all possible. The question is, how could they be brought about? The only way through the United Nations system and the Bretton Woods institutions that they can be brought about is collaboratively, but with a collaborative approach embraced both in Washington and in Beijing. That is best for us all. We've begun to see early signs of that possibility in terms of the new world of climate change collaboration between Beijing and Washington since the summit between the two countries' leaders held in Beijing last November. We need to see more such work between now and the upcoming visit of Xi Jinping to the United States and the critical conference of the parties to be held in Paris this December. For effective climate change to work globally requires the United States and China to work openly, transparently, and constructively together as the world's number 1 and number 2 emitters of global greenhouse gas emissions. There is no alternative. These two countries have the future of the planet in their hands. But to build from that and then to embrace other forms of institutional reform across the rest of the United Nations system remains a future prospect for this relationship as well. There is therefore, in my view, hope and possibility for US-Chinese collaboration in the continued reform of the UN and Bretton Woods-based multilateral system. But such cooperation is by no means inevitable. And if we head in the reverse direction, let us always reflect on what the gradual disintegration of international orders has meant in history. Let us never forget the Somme. Let us never forget the gates of Auschwitz. Let us never forget the refugees in and around Syria today. The real human consequences of global disorder if we allow that to happen. All this requires, of course, leadership, political leadership, diplomatic leadership, intellectual leadership, policy leadership. And that is where, again, this Academy and those like it around the world, which take the study of the United States, the study of China, and their roles within the international system seriously. As Wellington concluded his doctoral thesis back in 2015, quote, "China in progress and power means the Far East in permanent peace." My friends, and those of you who are students at this great university, you too have a contribution to make. Contribution in ideas, contribution in future leadership, contribution in making a difference. There is nothing determinist in international relations history. Women and men shape the institutions of the future. They shape decisions on war and peace. They shape decisions on collaboration or conflict. And that is why universities such as this, where you have the time and opportunity and luxury of reflecting and engaging with one another from across the world, provide this unique opportunity for preparation for service in an important global task for the future. I thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Rudd, for once again enhancing our understanding of China's growing importance and role in the world. Listening to your message today and in Guiyang last June at the Eco Forum, I'm once again impressed by your vision, sophistication, and deep knowledge of China's trajectory. If only American politicians could show that kind of vision, particularly in debates on the cable news network. My Earth Institute and SIPA colleague, Dr. Guodong, knows how little I know about China. And in our research collaboration on sustainability metrics in China, he's been very patient teaching me about China's politics, culture, and history. I only have a couple of thousand more years to go until I'm up to speed. So I'm starting now, and I hope to continue. What China is teaching us, though, is that we are now in the midst of a rapidly changing world economy and world society. Technology has transformed us. Barcodes, containerized shipping, GPS, inexpensive computing and information, instantaneous and low-cost communication, and robotics have combined to create a highly networked, interdependent world economy. A product designed in America may be assembled in China of parts manufactured in 50 countries around the world. This is unprecedented. This is a new fact of global economic life. And we need to understand the political and environmental impact of these technologies. There are 7 billion cell phones on the planet, and many of them are smartphones. The web transmits images of our wealth and our lifestyle to every corner of the planet, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The impact of these images creates ferocious political pressure for rapid economic development. This pressure is felt by many of the regimes in the developing world, including China. This political pressure places coal in power plants and black air in the lungs of anyone trying to breathe in Beijing. And what I've learned in my study of China, just like here in America, is that human beings like to breathe. It's kind of essential. We're all biological creatures who require food, water, and air to survive. And the same pressure to develop the economy is being transformed into a pressure to protect public health. I've seen this in China firsthand. It happened here in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and it's happening in China today. The fundamental, irreducible function of government is safety and security, and a polluted world is an unsafe world. Paradoxically, we're fortunate that burning fossil fuels not only causes climate change, it also causes visible and immediately unhealthy air pollution. The political problem with climate change is that it's created everywhere, and its impact is largely in the future. Traditional pollutants have a more visible and immediate sensory and political impact. Our senses directly and immediately experience toxics in our water, air, and soil, and that in turn impacts politics immediately and directly. In America, in the 1980s, through the use of technology and regulation, we decoupled the growth of our economy from the growth of pollution. And in the next decade, I believe we're going to witness the same phenomenon in China. So our deep need to share this beautiful blue sphere in the vacuum of space is powerful motivation to learn how to cooperate and live in peace. I fully agree with your point that China and the US as the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, must learn how to control those gases together. That it is that combination that will save the world. And in fact, as you just said, they hold the fate of the world in their hands. Public servants like Prime Minister Rudd, who have devoted their careers to building global understanding, give me great hope that we're going to succeed in building a sustainable future. So thank you for your impressive and really profound remarks, and thank you for visiting here at Columbia University.
I know you're all eagerly awaiting your turn to talk to Prime Minister Rudd, but just wait for a few minutes so that I can at least ask him a few questions. First of all, welcome to my new home, which is not so new anymore, and I'm delighted.
It's a big apartment you've got here. Is this on?
There you go. Is it on?
Hello, can
Yes,
you hear me?
yeah.
Right, got it.
But I'm also delighted that you are at my old home at the Asia Society. Given that you have such a profound understanding of China's philosophical trajectory, historical trajectory, and therefore you understand its contemporary realities from that perspective, one might argue that the philosophical trajectory of this country and its emphasis on this kind of individualism, freedom of expression in one hand, democracy on the other hand, that these are perhaps not as compatible or not at all compatible. And you have argued for something called constructive realism, agree to disagree. But the leaders, even if they want to do that, sometimes they have compulsions, as you know as a politician, that come from below. So you have the Senate or the Congress in the United States that says, we're not going to sign anything to do with climate control and climate change treaty. How do you think that the leaders, even if they want to work together, deal with the compulsions, both from here but also in China, that really come up, that really make it difficult to collaborate, to really imagine this shared future? What would be your advice to the leaders?
My own judgment, Vishakha, is that having been a practitioner in international politics, is that essentially decisions are made on a combination of three factors. One is the values that you share or don't share. The second is the interests that you share or don't share. And the third is the leadership which actually arbitrates the above. None of these are freestanding entities. They have to be synthesized in a decision. So let me run through those in a little sequence. On the question of values that you just mentioned, I have a fairly radical view, which is that Chinese values are not hugely different from Western values. There are huge intersection points. In the classic binary of a bunch of gung-ho American individualists riding horses up San Juan Hill and how the West was won, Annie get your gun and all the rest of it, against a bunch of quiet collective Confucians sitting over here studying Taoism and the Lunyu and the other classics of Chinese learning, I think is partly a fiction of our respective popular cultures, or at least our popular media. When I've lived in China, I've visited there more than 100 times over the years, and over the last 35 years, I find Chinese individuals, frankly, have the same aspirations as anyone I've ever met in the West. They want to look after their families, they want to look after themselves, they want to have a decent standard of living, they want their kids to be safe, they'd like clean air to breathe, and they'd like to have increasing levels of participation in the decision-making of their country. And that runs against other elements in the Chinese classical tradition which do not have a ready precedent in terms of Western liberal democracy. You go through the imperial tradition, you go through the attempts at political reform in the 20s and 30s in China, and of course the added complication of the Japanese invasion. It has been a much more concentrated exercise of political power over the centuries of Chinese imperial and republican experience. But we also reflect on the fact that in the West, the innovation of what we call liberal democracy was actually quite recent against the span of history. We only had the Glorious Revolution in 1688. This university, as King's College, existed before you Americans decided to have a revolution yourselves. That's when I gather you changed the name from King's College to Columbia. Well done, by the way. I'm a Republican myself. Not in the party sense. I believe in a republic as opposed to a monarchy. And frankly, the evolution of what we would describe as universal suffrage and voting in elections is an essentially late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon. The universal franchise did not exist in most countries until about the 1920s, less than 100 years ago. And so we ask ourselves the question, is there some fundamental, irreversible divide in Chinese and, let's call it American or Western views of the world? Well, I'm not so sure. I think both traditions have similar aspirations, but are reflecting them against different timetables and different sets of cultural conditionalities. That's on the values thing. Just quickly on interests. My experience of Chinese and American political leaders is that they're pretty smart. They actually reflect deep and hard on the interests which they share. And in China's case and America's case, here we have the list of things that you disagree on: cybersecurity, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the future regulation of NGOs in China, etc., together with other anxieties which have been around for a while. And here is the list of the things you actually agree on in terms of what I'd describe as bilateral investment treaties, which you're still working on, global climate change collaboration, opening lines of collaboration about what to do about North Korean nuclear proliferation, dealing with the common concerns which China and the United States share on terrorism across Central Asia and beyond, because it affects all countries, as well as a range of other practical domains as well. So it depends whether we engage our focus exclusively on what the difficulties are, or whether we try to hold that in tension with where the commonalities of interest lie. And so lastly, that is why in the work I did at Harvard Kennedy School last year, I decided to frame an idea which is, in the US-China relationship of the future, we need a strategic framework which is capable of addressing significant difference and significant commonalities simultaneously, and not to allow one to absolutely exclude the other. And through collaborative work over time, reduce the differences and maximise the agreements. I call that constructive realism. Yes. If you're an international relations theorist, you would say it's a contradiction in terms, but I'm not an international relations theorist, so I don't care. But constructive in the sense of here are the things you can work on, realist, here are the things we disagree on. But my last concept is for a common purpose. And the common purpose is building step by step the strength of the global order over time, because as great powers, China and the United States have an interest in a properly functioning global order, not one which becomes chaotic and in fact disappears. If there's one word which terrifies every Chinese politician that I've ever met and every Chinese political leader in Chinese history, it is as follows: 搞乱. You don't want to have 搞乱 in the 国际秩序. You don't want to have chaos in the international system, because 搞乱, creating chaos, frankly, it's a big problem in the normal conduct of the interests and values of all nation states.
So you feel that this idea of agree to disagree is the way that the leaders, when they create these compulsions and pressures that come from within, have to manage, and that's where the politicians have to really make sure that the pressures don't overwhelm the possibility of working together. Yes?
The role of political leadership is to put a framework around these things. I do not think the current differences between China and the United States mandate the inevitability of conflict and war. I just don't believe that. I don't think it's within the thinking of either country's leadership either. Therefore, what's the political framework or the foreign policy framework or the bilateral framework which provides you with a basis of managing the enormous complexity and diversity of this relationship, where you do have some conflicts of values, where you do have some conflicts of interest. At the same time, you do have commonality of values concerning the global commons when it comes to climate change, and you do have common interests when it comes to dealing with non-state actors like ISIS, ISIL, and other Islamist terrorist organizations. So my argument for political leadership is you need a strategic concept to frame that in. Why? Explain it to the respective peoples of both countries as what you're trying to work on. You can't keep public opinion at home thinking the other guy's really bad, horrible, terrible, and evil, and expect that not to have an effect. And that applies as much to my Chinese friends as it does to my American friends. But the other virtue of an organizing strategic principle is it provides a discipline within the structures of international government systems as well, so the Pentagon and state and their Chinese equivalents know which way the leadership wishes to march.
Right. Terrific. I'm going to open it up, and what I will suggest is that you line up right away, and please identify yourself. And I will start with you, Jeff, the co-chair of the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought.
Thank you for the lecture and the remarks, Mr. Rudd. On behalf of the entire Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought, I'd like to say that we're very honored to have you speak to us today. Now, my question is, you, of course, have just kind of advocated for the constructive realism in bilateral US and China relations. So we know the change of administration has an enormous effect on the dialogue between countries. So given the current leading candidates in the party nomination in the US, how would a possible Clinton, Bush, Sanders, and dare I say it, a Trump administration or presidency change the nature of the US foreign policy towards China?
Yeah, right. Okay, good. The last thing you have is a visiting politician, or someone who's now a resident of the United States, providing rolling commentary on the merits or demerits of the US political system.
And having just had changes in your own country.
Yeah, and
right
we're not
now.
in a position to preach here. So, so I'm always cautious about providing public advice to the political process here in the United States or in the People's Republic of China, where I spend a lot of time. A few observations, though. Historically, I think the elites in China are accustomed to the fact that there's usually a lot of theatrics on the China question associated with presidential campaigns. And there's a certain discount factor which applies to that. What I'm more concerned about is if there is a fundamental sea change in the deep American view of China. And here I am a little concerned, to be blunt. If I put together the issues I tripped through just before, cybersecurity, whether it applies state to state or corporation to corporation, the position which the United States and Japan have, and some of its allies in Southeast Asia have, towards South China Sea and East China Sea, NGO laws, I do worry about the beginnings of emergence of a grand coalition in this country against China, coming from the NGO community, coming from the corporate community, coming from the national security community. Historically, the big bulwark of support for the China-US relationship has been the US business community. That's much weaker than it used to be.
Much weaker.
So what I am concerned about is what I identify to be a slow and steady drift. What I would describe as incremental strategic drift, taking the countries further apart. If I look at a university like this, it should not be the case. I mean, you come from all over the world, a large slab of you are from China, and I imagine a large slab of you are from the United States. And when I roll through universities like this, and Harvard and others that I speak at, you know, that is the model I have in my head for the future. But when I look at the drift in sentiment against the United States in China, the drift in sentiment against China here in the United States at different levels, I am concerned. Hence, the absolute importance of strategic leadership on the part of both capitals to hold these enterprises together, because people need to think what the alternative might be.
What I'm going to ask you is if we can keep the answers a little brief, because we have very
Okay, these
little...
will now be yes/no answers. Okay.
But we'll have you come here and teach, then we'll have more time. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Sherman, and I'm a graduate student over at Columbia SIPA. So my question for you is regarding cybersecurity, a little more detail. So cybersecurity itself, or cyber attacks, are hard to attribute, and so it's a lot of states or actors think of it as a, low risk, high reward kind of attack. So in terms of this issue of alleged cyber attacks originating from China, targeting the U.S., how should the U.S. or China find a solution to this problem while preventing, falling into what you call the Thucydides trap?
Okay, in 2 sentences, giving Vishakha's strong encouragement for brevity. 1, in both capitals, it's now seen as a big problem for both state-based and corporation-based. 2, there's an emerging recognition in both capitals and the need for, quote, rules of the road. And that is how to negotiate what is a very complex and sensitive national security and corporate domain. Number 3, this is unprecedented because it's never been done before, and the people who are working on it below the radar will readily tell you that. But finally, if they don't do it, cyber, in my view, has every potential to become the next generation of weapons of mass destruction. Without firing a shot, if you can disable the power generation system of the city of New York by flicking a switch through a cyber attack, or turn blind an entire communication system of a military somewhere, frankly, you're looking at a whole level of risk which we haven't had to contemplate before.
Thank you.
Hi.
Please.
My name is Rohini Parikh, and I'm a Teachers College alumna, and I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and I began my English teaching career in China. So I have a very special place in my heart for China. I really loved my experience there. And I was in the Peace Corps Fellows Program at TC, and I was actually the first returned Peace Corps volunteer from China to enter the Peace Corps Fellows Program at TC. So I'm very proud of that, and I really love my experience. And I wanted to ask you, could you talk about some of the U.S. development work that's going on in China now? Because I know there are still Peace Corps volunteers serving in China, and we just began Peace Corps in China in 1993, and I was there from 1997 to 1999. So if you could just talk about U.S. development work in China now.
Yeah, sure. As an Australian, I don't know a lot about what you're doing in the Peace Corps in China, but I do know that a whole bunch of international NGOs like Peace Corps in the United States, which in my view has a great history, going back to, who's the guy who invented the Peace Corps? What was his name? The American who invented the Peace Corps, Kennedy administration.
Shriver.
Thank you, Shriver.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
I had a little mental block in my modern American history. Great job, not just in China, elsewhere. Huge role being played by NGOs right across the country, both domestic and international. And here's the new trend. Chinese NGOs working in the rest of the world. Not a bad thing either, on common development projects in Africa and elsewhere. So I believe this whole collaboration between NGOs is a great thing for the future.
But just to push you a little on that,
You asked me to be brief.
I know, that's why you'll have to answer this. And that is that in China right now, there's obviously a concern about the NGOs, not so much in the climate change or the area that deal with pollution, but in many other areas. And people are very concerned about the new laws that might come up. So how does that affect this idea of NGO movement and collaboration?
Well, that's why I've listed a couple of times today this list of what I believe is capable of derailing the relationship. The draft laws currently before the National People's Congress, called an exposure draft, on the regulation of NGOs. It's 非政府管理法, I think. 非政府机构的管理法, that's right. It's out there for comment and submissions. Universities across this country and NGOs across this country have submitted. The process of review is underway. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I know this is a highly sensitive question both within the Chinese leadership and within the international NGO community. I really hope, urge and pray to find a creative way through this one, because NGOs have been remarkably constructive in, frankly, extending the whole net of international contact between China and the rest of the world in the last 30 years.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Prime Minister. My name is Mark. I'm from the Graduate School of Business. And you touched on it a little bit, but you spoke about how China does not want to fundamentally change the existing world order. But you look at its actions in the South China Sea, and you see that they're building bases in defiance, for example, of the Philippines' case in the UN tribunal. So how do China's actions in the South China Sea speak of its intentions for the future of the global world order?
It's a good question, which is why I try to actually put the answers into quite different contexts. The Chinese territorial claim in the South China Sea, on which I have no position, for or against, same with the East China Sea on Senkaku Diaoyuda, complex legal question that the international lawyers sorted out one day, is that it has been a long-standing Chinese territorial claim, as it has been by the surrounding countries in Southeast Asia, in the case of Japan, in the East China Sea as well. These, therefore, fall within what I would describe as a highly sensitive domain of territorial positions adopted by China post-49. They also apply to questions like Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and the offshore territories, claims in those two seas. I think we make a mistake to simply mechanically extrapolate from those historical positions on territorial claim in and around, let's call it mainland China, to China's posture on the future of the UN system, China's posture on the future of the Bretton Woods institutions, China's posture on how we maintain order in chaotic parts of the world. That is the distinction I seek to make. A question which has been put to our Chinese friends recently, however, is how they will seek to constructively engage in the reform process of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, which demonstrates to the world that they actually wish to sustain the order. So far I see some positive signs on that from China, beginning in their, frankly, commitment to multilateral aid frameworks rather than purely bilateralizing everything. And so I think it's important at this stage to quarantine these two debates for the logic I've just suggested.
And we have time only for 2 more questions after this.
Sorry, guys.
Sorry.
Hello, my name is Isabel Decatona. I'm a first year at Barnard. So my question is, how does this idea, or how prevalent is this idea of the Middle Kingdom in the current Chinese administration? And how can that be, how do you see that kind of playing out in the world, or in a world of countries that expect them to show responsibility, which is not to say that they already have, but...
Yep, sounds like you've been reading Kissinger's book on China. And in Henry's book, who I talk to a lot, I think he's a great China analyst and a great contributor, obviously, by definition, to the US-China relationship. Henry has a very interesting first chapter in his book on the notion of the Middle Kingdom. 中国, if you don't speak Chinese, 中, middle, 国, kingdom. It's a concept of Chinese centrality which has been around from the get-go. Historically, it has not been a prescription which says that therefore any other foreign entity is therefore by definition at variance from China's own central governance. It doesn't have that view. Historically, its view was that, frankly, we China don't need any of the rest of you because we are the Middle Kingdom. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And that was the view under Lord Macartney's famous expedition to Beijing in 1792, and the Qianlong Emperor said through him to George III, thank you for bringing all these trinkets. We don't need them. Goodbye. Go home and say hi to the king when you get there. That is classical 中国 attitude to the self-sufficiency of this Middle Kingdom. Where some Chinese neighbouring states have raised concerns is where states have been themselves part of a wider Confucian cultural influence in Korea or in parts of Vietnam or in other neighbouring states. Whether there is in fact an expectation by those who have ruled the Middle Kingdom over the centuries that those neighbouring states have a natural sense of the centrality of the Middle Kingdom as well. This is openly discussed and debated within academies from everywhere from Seoul to Tokyo to Singapore and points in between. I think, frankly, the core challenge in the current period is to deal with China as a large global nation state now fully embracing its international challenges and responsibilities, and we should embrace it on those terms without disappearing down a tunnel of excessive historical analysis to the view that the views of Zhongguo in the middle Qing period under Qianlong reflect what the Chinese are going to do tomorrow with the United States. I don't think that holds.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Eric. I'm a first year at Columbia College. Thank you for a lecture. I read that you wrote your college thesis on Wei Jingsheng, a democracy wall activist in China.
Yeah.
How do you see the dissident community in China today play a role in China or in like Sino-America relationship? And on a larger scale, how much do you think Australia, America, or the West in general can influence the internal political processes of China? Thank you.
Let me take the last part of your question first. It's an important question. It's about how China charts its own political future. I start from a pretty unremarkable point of view that the Chinese will sort this out themselves over time. What sort of political future you want for your own country. Secondly, I have never been utterly convinced that Chinese policy positions are changed as a consequence of declaratory positions from other governments, whether it's the United States or elsewhere in the West, saying X, Y, and Z must change by tomorrow. Instead, what I have seen in my own experience of China, which goes back to when I went to live there in 1984, an ominous year in Orwellian history, and have been in and out of the country since then, is the personal liberty of most Chinese folks has increased phenomenally in the intervening 30 years or so. If you picture a glass of water, the China that I went to live in 1984, the water is about how much individual liberty people had in China back in 1984. Back in those days, you couldn't choose what clothes you wore. Your dress would not be acceptable. You would either be in a green mouse suit or a blue mouse suit. That was it. You'd be told when you could get married. You'd be told where you would study, if you could study. You'd be told if and when you would go to work in what institution. And for the 2 or 3 of you in this group who might have been approved as a Chinese scholarship student, you might have been able to study overseas under strict supervision. Now, the China of today is a little bit different. And it's not a glass which is full against a civil libertarian standard, but frankly, it's more like that. And what has changed is that, well, you guys are here. What has changed is when I go to Beijing, I have conversations openly with a whole bunch of Chinese about practically anything that they want to talk about. I find that in China now there is a huge and open gay culture. And homosexuality 30 years ago was just inconceivable in Chinese normal, polite discourse. I see this sort of artistic creativity emerging in China as well. This is, of course, where the Chinese Communist Party says you in China shall not discuss alternative systems to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that's where you are up to. How you choose to deal with the glass in the future and its contents is a matter for bright young people like you and how you determine your country's future, rather than having folks like me tell you how the glass might be filled one day.
On that note, I'm so sorry. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Honorable Kevin Rudd for being here, and I hope this is not the first nor the last time. We look forward to seeing more of you now that you are resident of New York City. Thank you.
Thanks also for all of you for coming. For those of you who are students of China or Chinese students here, I'm not just saying this to be polite, but the future really does lie in your hands. Your generation, tens of thousands of Chinese students studying around the world, mixing with all these students from everywhere. There's a huge opportunity for you to shape new realities for the future and to avoid all the mistakes that have been made in the past. And you are at a great institution which enables that to be the case. So I see in this audience another dozen or so Wellington coups, and they won't all be men. In fact, the majority will be women. Thank you very much.